Sometimes grief doesn't just break your heart, it builds walls so high that nobody can climb them. For 2 years, Sarah McKenna had been that kind of broken, the kind folks whispered about but never tried to help. In a dusty frontier town, everyone believed the widow was beyond saving. Her anger kept people away. Her sorrow made them afraid. Then, a mountain man named Caleb Stone rode in. He'd lost plenty himself and knew what real pain looked like. When Sarah's rage exploded in the town square, Caleb didn't back down. He stepped forward and saw what nobody else could see: a woman worth fighting for. What he did that night proved them all wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a valley where the wind carried the scent of pine and sage across dusty streets. It was 1874, and Wyoming territory still felt wild enough that a man could disappear into the mountains and never be found. The town itself was small, maybe 200 souls on a good Sunday, but it had everything a frontier community needed. A general store run by Martha Collins, a woman with silver hair and knowing eyes who'd buried 2 husbands herself. A saloon where miners and ranch hands spent their wages, a doctor's office where old Doc Hartley set bones and delivered babies, and occasionally pulled bullets from men who'd made poor choices. Sheriff Ben Wade kept what peace there was to keep, which wasn't much most days. The McKenna Ranch sat 3 miles outside town, tucked against the foothills where the grassland met the timber. It had been a fine spread once. Thomas McKenna had built it with his own hands, starting with a cabin and adding on as his fortunes improved. He'd worked a small silver claim up in the mountains, nothing that would make him rich, but enough to keep a roof overhead and plans for the future. He'd married Sarah Brennan when she was 22, a schoolteacher from back east who'd come west looking for something different than parlors and propriety. They'd been happy. Everyone in town could see it. The way Thomas's face lit up when Sarah drove the wagon into town for supplies, the way she'd touch his arm when they walked together, casual and comfortable, like they'd been married 50 years instead of 5. They'd talked about children, about expanding the ranch, about growing old together, watching sunsets from their porch. Those kinds of dreams that feel solid when you're young and in love, like nothing could ever shake them loose. Then the mine took Thomas. A support beam gave way, they said. Cave in. He'd been working alone that day, which wasn't unusual for a small operation. By the time anyone found him, he'd been dead for hours. They brought his body down on a mule, and Sarah's whole world collapsed with that mountain. The funeral was well attended. The whole town came out, bearing food and sympathy and helpless looks. Sarah stood by the grave like she was carved from stone, her face pale and empty. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at that wooden coffin like if she looked hard enough she could will her husband back to life. When they lowered him into the ground, something in her seemed to go down with him. For a few months people tried. Martha brought casseroles and sat on Sarah's porch, talking gently about grief and time and healing. Doc Hartley stopped by to check on her, worried about her health. Sheriff Wade made sure to ride past the ranch regularly, just to see that she was managing. Young women from the church offered to help with chores. But Sarah turned them all away, politely at first, then with increasing coldness. The ranch began to show neglect. Fences sagged. Weeds overtook the garden Sarah had once tended so carefully. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. The paint on the house peeled and faded. It was like watching something die in slow motion, and the town could only stand by and witness it. Sarah herself changed in ways that hurt to see. The warmth left her eyes. Her movements became sharp and quick, like an animal that expected attack. She came to town only when necessary, speaking to no one unless she had to, her jaw tight and her gaze distant. She wore the same dark dress every time, mourning clothes that she seemed determined never to take off. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain, hung her wedding ring. She'd stopped wearing it on her finger. but she couldn't let it go entirely. People whispered, the way people do, poor Sarah, such a shame, so young to be a widow, someone should do something. But nobody did, not really, because what could they do? Grief, like hers, was a fortress, and she'd made it clear she wanted no visitors. Then, 2 years to the month after Thomas died, a stranger rode into Redemption Creek, leading a pack-horse laden with supplies. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick, dark beard shot through with grey, and eyes that had seen considerable weather. He wore buckskin and wool, mountain clothes, broken in and practical. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent more time alone than in company, who knew how to read the land and the sky and the subtle shifts in the wind. He took a room at the boarding house run by Widow Crane, paying for a week in advance with silver coins that had the dull shine of hard use. He didn't offer his name right away, and Mrs. Crane, who'd learned not to pry into the business of men who came down from the mountains, didn't ask. But by evening, word had spread. The stranger's name was Caleb Stone. He'd been living up in the high country for 3 years, trapping and hunting, keeping to himself. He'd come down because winter supplies were running low, and he needed a farrier to shoe his horse. He wasn't unfriendly exactly. He nodded to folks who greeted him, answered direct questions with economy and courtesy. But he didn't volunteer much, and there was a quality to his silence that suggested a man who'd left something behind and had no interest in discussing what it was. Doc Hartley, who made a habit of befriending newcomers over chess and whiskey, invited Caleb to his office that first evening. They played 3 games, and Doc won 2 of them, which pleased him because it suggested the mountain man had a mind that could be distracted. Over the 3rd game, as the light faded and the lamps were lit, Doc asked the question he asked everyone eventually. What brings a man down from the high country? Caleb studied the chessboard, moved his knight, and said simply, "Got tired of my own company." Doc nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. That can happen. Mountains are beautiful, but they don't talk back. Sometimes that's a blessing, Caleb said, but there was no bitterness in it, just observation. Sometimes, Doc agreed. He moved his bishop, claiming Caleb's rook. You planning to stay in these parts? Caleb shrugged. Haven't decided. Depends on what there is to stay for. It was the kind of answer that could mean anything or nothing, and Doc let it rest. But he noticed, as the evening wore on, that Caleb asked questions about the town. Not prying questions, just the kind any newcomer might ask. How long had Redemption Creek been here? What did folks do for work? Was it a peaceful place? And eventually, casually, as if it didn't matter much, saw a woman earlier, dark dress, kept to herself, looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. Doc's expression shifted, sadness crossing his weathered face. That'd be Sarah McKenna. Lost her husband 2 years back, mining accident. She took it hard. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. It is, Doc said, watching the mountain man carefully. Some people carry it better than others. Sarah, she's locked herself away with it. Won't let anyone close. We've tried, but he spread his hands helplessly. Caleb nodded slowly, saying nothing, but something in his expression suggested he understood more about that kind of grief than most. The next morning, Caleb was up early, taking his horse to the smithy. He spent the day quietly, walking the town, observing. He bought supplies at Martha's store, and she, with her gift for reading people, sensed something different about this one. Not dangerous exactly, but purposeful, like a man who'd made some decision and was working his way toward it. That afternoon, he was standing outside the saloon when he saw Sarah McKenna drive her wagon down the main street. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself apart from everything around her. She tied up outside the general store and went inside, her movements quick and efficient, a woman who wanted to complete her business and leave. Caleb watched her, recognition flickering in his eyes, not of the woman herself, but of what she carried. He'd seen that particular kind of pain before. Hell, he'd worn it himself. Still did. Some days, though time had dulled its sharpest edges, he didn't approach her, didn't even think about it. Not then, but he noticed, and he filed it away, and when he went back to the boarding house that evening, he sat on the porch and thought about fortresses, and grief, and what it took to survive when the world took away the person you'd built your life around. It was 3 days later when everything changed. Billy Tucker was a ranch hand who worked for the Dawson spread east of town. He was young, maybe 22, with more enthusiasm than sense and a fondness for whiskey that got him into trouble more often than not. He'd been riding the high country checking on stray cattle when he'd stumbled across an old mine shaft, partially collapsed, that he didn't recognize. Curious and always hopeful he might find something valuable, he'd climbed down into the accessible part. What he found, wedged between two rocks near what had once been a support beam, was a pocket watch. It was silver, tarnished but still intact, with ornate engraving on the case. Billy didn't think much about where it came from. Finders keepers, as far as he was concerned. He pocketed it and rode back to town, pleased with his discovery. He made his first mistake at the saloon that evening, showing it off to the other hands. The watch was a fine piece, better than anything Billy could afford, and he enjoyed the attention it brought him. He sat at the bar, flipping it open and closed, letting the lamplight catch on the silver. Doc Hartley was there, playing cards at a corner table. He glanced over at the commotion, saw the watch, and his face went pale. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped loud against the wooden floor. "Billy," he said, his voice tight, "where did you get that?" Billy, emboldened by whiskey, grinned. "Found it up in the hills. Pretty nice, ain't it?" Doc crossed the room in 3 strides and took the watch from Billy's hand before the young man could protest. He opened it, and his worst fear was confirmed. Inside the case, engraved in delicate script, were the initials T.M. and a date. Thomas and Sarah's wedding day. "Dear God," Doc breathed, "this is Thomas McKenna's watch." The saloon went quiet. Every man there knew what that meant. Thomas had been wearing that watch the day he died. It should have been buried with him, or given to Sarah. Its presence here, in Billy's careless hands, was wrong on every level. "I didn't know," Billy stammered, suddenly sober. "I just found it. I didn't steal it from no grave, I swear." "Where exactly did you find it?" Sheriff Wade had appeared at Doc's shoulder, his expression grim. Billy explained about the mine shaft, the location up in the hills. Wade and Doc exchanged looks. That wasn't where Thomas had died, or at least not where they'd found his body, which meant either the watch had been moved or something about the story of Thomas's death was incomplete. But that mystery became secondary in the next moment because the saloon doors swung open and Sarah McKenna walked in. It wasn't common for women to enter the saloon, though it wasn't strictly forbidden either. But Sarah hadn't set foot in this place since Thomas died. She'd come to town for lamp oil and had been about to head home when she'd heard the commotion, heard Thomas's name, spoken loud enough to carry through the door. She stood in the doorway, her dark dress stark against the evening light behind her. Her eyes found the watch in Doc's hand, and something fundamental shifted in her expression. All the careful control she'd maintained for 2 years cracked like ice over a spring thaw. "That's Thomas's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Doc moved toward her, holding the watch carefully. "Sarah, I know this must be..." But she wasn't looking at Doc. She was looking at Billy Tucker, and the rage building in her eyes was terrible to see. "You," she said, her voice rising, "you had Thomas's watch. You took it from him." "No, ma'am, I swear I just found it." "Liar!" The word came out as a scream. Sarah lunged forward, and before anyone could react, she'd grabbed Billy by his shirt and slammed him back against the bar. She was a small woman, but fury gave her strength. "You robbed his body. You left him in that mine to die, and you took his watch. Sarah, no. Sheriff Wade tried to pull her back, but she fought him, wild and beyond reason. Billy, terrified and confused, tried to defend himself. I didn't do nothing. I found it in a mine shaft. The mine where you left him to die. Sarah's hands were around Billy's throat now, and it took both Wade and Doc to pry her loose. She fought them like a cornered animal, screaming accusations and grief and rage that had been bottled up for 2 years. Men backed away, uncomfortable witnesses to such raw pain. Billy scrambled behind the bar, shaken and pale. They managed to get Sarah outside, but she broke free again in the town square. She stood in the middle of the street, breathing hard, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face streaked with tears. She probably didn't realize she was crying. 2 years, she said to no one and everyone. 2 years I've carried this, and you all just watched. You let whoever did this walk free. You let them keep his things like trophies. Sarah, nobody did anything to Thomas, Doc said gently, though his own certainty was shaken by the watch's appearance. It was an accident. Was it? She laughed, bitter and broken. Then how does his watch end up in a different mine? How does that happen by accident? No one had an answer for her. A crowd had gathered now, townspeople drawn by the commotion. They formed a loose circle around Sarah, uncertain and helpless. That's when Caleb Stone stepped forward. He'd been across the street at the general store when he'd heard the screaming. He'd come to see what the trouble was and had watched the whole scene unfold from the edge of the crowd. Now he moved through the circle of onlookers, his steps slow and deliberate, his hands visible and empty. Sarah saw him coming and turned on him, her rage finding a new target. What do you want? Come to stare like the rest of them? Caleb stopped about 10 feet away, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered, close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. No, ma'am, he said quietly. I came because I know what it's like to be angry at the whole world because the one person you want to be angry at is gone. Sarah stared at him, her chest heaving. You don't know anything about me. I know you loved your husband, Caleb said. I know he died and left you alone, and that's not fair, and it's not right. I know you've been carrying that anger because it's the only thing that feels like you're still fighting for him. And I know that watch in Doc's hand feels like someone stole the last piece of Thomas from you. His words cut through her rage like a knife. Sarah's expression crumbled, confusion replacing fury. Who are you? She whispered. Someone who understands, Caleb said simply. My wife died 3 years ago. For a long time after, I wanted to hit something, break something, make someone else hurt the way I was hurting. So I know, ma'am. I know exactly how you feel right now. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone in that square had tried to comfort Sarah at some point over the past 2 years. They'd offered sympathy, casseroles, prayers, helpful advice about time healing all wounds. But no one had ever simply said, I understand. I've been where you are. Your anger makes sense. Sarah's knees seemed to give out. She didn't fall, but she swayed, and for a moment it looked like she might. Caleb took a step forward, instinctive, but didn't reach for her, giving her the choice. Martha Collins broke from the crowd and went to Sarah, putting an arm around her shoulders. Sarah let herself be held, which was something no one had seen her do since the funeral. I can't do this anymore, Sarah said, so quietly most people couldn't hear. I can't carry this by myself anymore. Then don't, Martha said firmly. Let us help. Let someone help. Sarah pulled away, shaking her head. She looked at Caleb one more time, something unreadable in her expression, then turned and walked toward her wagon. Her movements were stiff, mechanical. She climbed up to the seat, took the reins, and drove out of town without looking back. The crowd dispersed slowly, people returning to their homes with troubled expressions. Doc Hartley held Thomas's pocket watch carefully, wondering what to do with it. Sheriff Wade questioned Billy Tucker more thoroughly, taking notes about the exact location of the mine where the watch had been found. Caleb stood in the square as the twilight deepened, watching the road Sarah had taken out of town. Something in his expression was resolved, decided. He walked back to the boarding house, saddled his horse, and packed a few supplies into his saddlebags. Mrs. Crane watched from the porch as he mounted up. "You're going after her," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. She might shoot you. She's got a temper and a rifle, and not much left to lose." "I know." Mrs. Crane nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Mr. Stone. Foolish, maybe, but good." Caleb touched the brim of his hat to her and turned his horse toward the road that led to the McKenna ranch. Behind him, the town settled into evening, lamps being lit in windows, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing. But nothing about this night would be ordinary. Not for Sarah McKenna, and not for the mountain man riding out to meet her in her fortress of grief. Doc Hartley stood in his office window, the pocket watch still in his hand, and watched Caleb ride away. He thought about courage, and what it meant to face someone else's pain when you'd barely survived your own. He thought about Sarah, alone on that ranch, and about the stranger who'd seen something in her that no one else had seen. Not a lost cause, but a woman worth fighting for. He set the watch on his desk, opened his ledger, and began to write. If they were going to find out what really happened to Thomas McKenna, they'd need to start asking better questions. And if that watch had ended up in a different mine, then maybe the story they'd all accepted 2 years ago wasn't the whole truth. Outside, the stars came out over Redemption Creek, cold and distant and beautiful. And somewhere on the road between town and an isolated ranch, a mountain man rode toward a confrontation that would change 2 lives forever. Caleb worked through the night, stopping only when the first grey light of dawn began to soften the eastern sky. He'd repaired the main fence line, cleared the debris from around the well, and fixed the barn door so it hung straight again. Small victories, but they added up. He found the blankets Sarah had mentioned and made himself a rough bed in the barn's hayloft. It smelled of old hay and leather and dust, familiar scents that reminded him of his childhood on his father's farm. He slept lightly, the way he'd learned in the mountains, attuned to any unusual sound. When he woke a few hours later, the sun was well up, and he could smell coffee. He climbed down from the loft, brushed hay from his clothes, and stepped outside to find Sarah sitting on the porch with 2 cups set out. An invitation. He washed his hands and face at the pump, then joined her on the porch, taking the offered cup with a nod of thanks. The coffee was better this morning, still strong but with a smoothness that suggested she'd taken some care with it. "You've been busy," Sarah said, gesturing toward the repaired fence. "Couldn't sleep much anyway." Seemed like a good use of the time. They sat in companionable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the valley wake up. Birds called from the trees. A light breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost fragile, like something that could shatter with the wrong word. "I need to go into town," Sarah said finally. "Supplies are running low. I'll ride with you, if you'd like." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." An hour later, they were on the road to Redemption Creek, Sarah driving her wagon while Caleb rode alongside. She'd changed into a different dress, still dark but not quite so severe. Her hair was pinned up neatly. Small things, but they suggested someone who was starting to emerge from the fog of grief. They didn't talk much during the ride. There was no need. Sometimes the most comfortable thing was just presence, without the burden of conversation. When they reached town, heads turned. People noticed Sarah arriving with Caleb Stone riding beside her wagon. Noticed that she looked different somehow, still sad, still carrying her grief, but not quite so lost. The town's gossip mill would be working overtime by afternoon. Martha Collins saw them first. She was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her store when they pulled up, and her weathered face broke into a smile. "Sarah McKenna," she said warmly. "Good to see you, dear." "Martha." Sarah's response was cautious but not hostile. Progress. While Sarah went inside to gather supplies, Caleb waited on the boardwalk. Doc Hartley emerged from his office across the street and crossed over, his medical bag in hand. "Mr. Stone," he said, "heard you rode out to the McKenna place last night. News travels fast. Always does in a small town." Doc studied him with shrewd eyes. "How is she?" "Hurting," Caleb said honestly. "But maybe ready to start healing. Time will tell." Doc nodded slowly. "I'm glad someone finally got through to her. We've all been worried." He paused, weighing his words. "There's something you should know. After Thomas died, Sarah lost a baby. Not many people know she swore me to silence as her doctor. But if you're going to be around her, you should understand what she's carrying." "She told me," Caleb said. "Last night." Doc's eyebrows rose. "Did she? That's significant. She hasn't spoken of it to anyone, not even Martha. And those two were close as sisters once. Sometimes it's easier to tell a stranger. Less history to navigate. Perhaps." Doc shifted his medical bag to his other hand. "I also wanted to tell you something about that watch Billy found. Sheriff Wade and I rode out to the mine shaft yesterday. The location doesn't match where we found Thomas's body, which raises questions." Caleb's expression hardened. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest Thomas's death might not have been the accident we all assumed it was." Before Caleb could respond, Sheriff Wade himself appeared, as if summoned by the conversation. He was a solid man in his 50s, with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen his share of trouble. "Doc, Stone." He nodded to each of them. "I was hoping to have a word with Mrs. McKenna when she's finished in the store." "What about?" Caleb asked, his tone protective. "Just some follow-up questions about Thomas, about his activities in the weeks before he died. I'm starting to think we didn't ask enough questions 2 years ago." Sarah emerged from the store at that moment, her arms full of parcels. Martha followed with more supplies, helping load them into the wagon. She saw the 3 men standing together, and her expression grew wary. "Mrs. McKenna," Wade said, approaching respectfully, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband, about the days before his accident." Sarah's face went pale. "Why? What's happened?" "That watch Billy found has raised some concerns. The location doesn't match up with what we thought we knew about Thomas's death. I need to understand his movements better, his business dealings. Did he have any partners? Anyone he was working with at the mine?" Sarah set down the parcels she was holding, gripping the wagon for support. Caleb moved to her side instinctively, ready to steady her if needed. "There was someone," she said slowly, her voice tight. "A man from back east. Jack Morrison. He provided some of the capital for Thomas to expand his claim. They had a business arrangement." Wade pulled out a notebook, writing quickly. "What kind of arrangement?" "I don't know all the details. Thomas handled the business side of things, but Mr. Morrison would visit sometimes, and they'd go over papers in Thomas's office." She paused, a memory surfacing. "Thomas was troubled the last few weeks. I asked him what was wrong, but he said it was just business concerns, nothing for me to worry about." "Did Morrison visit around the time of the accident?" I don't remember. Maybe?" Sarah's distress was growing. "Why does this matter? What are you suggesting?" Wade looked uncomfortable. "I'm not suggesting anything yet, ma'am. Just trying to understand what happened. Do you still have any of Thomas's business papers?" "They're in his office at the house. I haven't touched anything in there." "I couldn't." Her voice broke. Caleb placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a quiet gesture of support. "Would you permit me to come out and look through those papers?" Wade asked. "With your permission, of course." Sarah looked overwhelmed, the fragile peace of the morning shattered. She turned to Caleb, seeking guidance. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "But if there's any chance of understanding what really happened to Thomas, it might be worth knowing." She nodded slowly. "All right. Yes, you can look at the papers. But I need to go home now." "Of course. I'll ride out this afternoon, if that's acceptable." Sarah agreed, and within minutes, she and Caleb were heading back toward the ranch, the wagon full of supplies, but the mood considerably darker than it had been on the journey in. They were halfway home when Sarah finally spoke. What if it wasn't an accident? Her voice was barely above a whisper. What if someone killed Thomas? Then we find out who and why, Caleb said firmly, and we make sure they answer for it. I don't know if I can do this. Opening it all up again, reliving it. You won't be doing it alone, Caleb interrupted. I'll be there. For as long as you need. Sarah looked at him, tears threatening. Why? Why would you do that for someone you barely know? Because Rebecca taught me that the best way to honor the dead is to keep living, and sometimes that means helping someone else learn how to live again too. The rest of the ride passed in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Heavier, weighted with the possibility that Sarah's world was about to be upended once more. But this time, at least, she wouldn't face it alone. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her unload the supplies and settle them in the house. He moved carefully through the space, aware that this was the first time he'd been properly inside. The house showed signs of the same neglect as the outside: dust on surfaces, dishes in the sink, a general air of abandonment. But there were also signs of the life that had been lived here. Photographs on the mantel showing Sarah and Thomas on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant. A quilt draped over the sofa, hand-stitched with care. Thomas's coat still hanging by the door, his boots beneath it, as if he might walk through at any moment and put them on. And on a shelf in the corner, partially hidden, was a small wooden toy horse, hand-carved and smoothed with love. The toy meant for the child who would never play with it. Caleb saw it, but said nothing, understanding that some griefs were too tender to speak aloud. They worked together in quiet efficiency, putting away the supplies, making the house functional again. It felt like a small reclaiming of space that had been surrendered to sorrow. By the time Sheriff Wade arrived that afternoon, they were as ready as they could be. Sarah led him to Thomas's office, a small room at the back of the house that she clearly hadn't entered in 2 years. The door stuck when she tried to open it, swollen with disuse. Caleb helped her force it open, and they stepped into a space frozen in time. Papers on the desk, a pen lying where it had been set down, a coat over the back of the chair. Everything waiting for a man who would never return. Sheriff Wade spent 2 hours going through Thomas's papers, while Sarah and Caleb waited in the main room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rustle of documents and Wade's occasional murmur as he made notes. When he finally emerged, his expression was grim. "Mrs. McKenna, did you know your husband had taken out a significant loan from Jack Morrison?" Sarah's face went white. "A loan? No, he never mentioned a loan." Wade held up a document. "According to this partnership agreement, Morrison provided $5,000 for mine expansion. In exchange, if Thomas died before repaying the debt, Morrison would have claim to 50% of the ranch and mining operation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Caleb moved closer, ready to catch her if she fell. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Thomas would never risk the ranch. This was our home, our future." "The document appears to be signed by both men," Wade said carefully. "Witnessed and notarized. But there's something odd about it. The dates don't quite line up with other correspondence I found. And Thomas's handwriting in his personal notes suggests he was concerned about Morrison's business practices in the weeks before his death." Sarah sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I think Thomas discovered something about Morrison that made him suspicious. And I think Morrison might have had reason to want Thomas dead before those suspicions became public knowledge." The words hung in the air, terrible in their implications. Murder, not an accident, but murder, for money and land. "Where is Morrison now?" Caleb asked, his voice hard. "That's the question," Wade said. "He left town shortly after Thomas's funeral, said he was returning to Denver." But I'm going to send some telegrams, see what I can find out about his current whereabouts and his business history." Sarah looked up, her eyes blazing with a fury that replaced shock. "If he killed Thomas, if he murdered my husband for this ranch, then he'll answer for it," Wade said firmly. "But I need time to build a case. These are serious accusations, and I need evidence that will hold up. Can you be patient, Mrs. McKenna?" "I've been patient for 2 years," Sarah said bitterly. "I can wait a little longer if it means justice for Thomas." Wade nodded, gathering the documents he needed. "I'll keep you informed. In the meantime, don't mention this to anyone. If Morrison hears we're investigating, he might disappear for good." After Wade left, Sarah sat in stunned silence. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Caleb made coffee, gave her space to process what she'd learned. Finally, she spoke. "I've spent 2 years thinking Thomas died in an accident. Blaming fate, blaming bad luck, blaming God. But if someone killed him," her voice cracked, "if someone deliberately took him from me, from our baby," she couldn't finish. The grief that had been transforming into something manageable suddenly had new, sharper edges. This wasn't just loss, it was theft. It was violence. Caleb sat across from her, letting her see his face, his steady presence. "Anger is natural," he said. "Use it, don't let it use you." "How?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "How do I not let it consume me?" "By remembering that revenge isn't the same as justice. By trusting Wade to do his job. By not letting Morrison's actions define the rest of your life." He leaned forward. "Thomas wouldn't want you destroyed by the same man who destroyed him?" Sarah closed her eyes, fighting for control. When she opened them again, there was steel in her expression alongside the grief. "I want to see the mine," she said. "The place where he died. I've never been there. I couldn't face it before, but now I need to see it." "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm going anyway." They rode out the next morning at first light, Sarah showing Caleb the path Thomas used to take up into the hills. It was a hard climb, rocky and steep in places, but both horses were sure-footed. The air grew thinner and cooler as they ascended. The mine entrance was marked by old timbers and a scatter of equipment left behind when the site was abandoned after Thomas's death. The opening yawned, dark and dangerous, partially collapsed as reported. Sarah dismounted and stood staring at the entrance. Caleb stayed back, letting her approach at her own pace. She walked to the opening, placed her hand on the weathered timber frame. Her lips moved, speaking to Thomas, Caleb realized, saying things she'd never had a chance to say. "Goodbye. I love you. I'm sorry. Forgive me." Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood there for long minutes, communing with the ghost of her husband in the place where his life had ended. When she finally turned back to Caleb, her face was raw but somehow clearer. "I needed to see it," she said, "to make it real. He really died here. Whatever happens with Morrison, whatever we find out, Thomas died in this place, and I'll never see him again." "No," Caleb agreed gently. "You won't. But I can keep living. I can find out what happened to him and make sure whoever's responsible pays." And then she paused, looking at the vast sky above them. "And then maybe I can finally let him rest. Let us both rest." They rode back down as the sun climbed higher, and something fundamental had shifted in Sarah. The grief hadn't disappeared, it never would, but it had transformed. She was no longer drowning in it. She was learning to carry it, to live alongside it, rather than being consumed by it. Back at the ranch, they worked together through the afternoon. Caleb continued repairs while Sarah began the slow process of reclaiming her house from neglect. She cleaned, organized, opened windows that had been closed for months, let light and air back into spaces that had become tombs. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah said something that surprised them both. "I'm glad you came to town when you did. I don't think I would have survived much longer the way I was going." You're stronger than you think, Caleb said. Maybe, but everyone needs help sometimes, even strong people. She glanced at him. Even you. He smiled slightly. Even me. Will you stay? Not just for a few days. Really stay. Help me figure out what happened to Thomas and what to do about Morrison. Help me. She hesitated. Help me remember how to live. Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd been breaking when he found her, who was now slowly piecing herself back together. He thought about his empty cabin in the mountains, about 3 years of solitude that had taught him everything except how to rejoin the world. I'll stay, he said, for as long as you need. Sarah nodded, relief and gratitude in her expression. They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, two people who'd been lost, finding their way towards something like hope. 3 days later, Jack Morrison returned to Redemption Creek. He arrived in a hired carriage, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as a man of means from back east. He was in his 40s, handsome in a practiced way, with slicked hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The kind of man who'd learned to wear charm like armor. Word reached the ranch before Morrison did. Martha Collins sent her son riding out with a warning. Sarah and Caleb were working in the barn when the boy arrived, breathless and worried. Ma says to tell you Jack Morrison's back in town, asking questions about Mrs. McKenna and the ranch. Sheriff Wade's watching him, but Ma thought you should know. Sarah's face hardened. Thank you, Peter. Tell your mother I appreciate the warning. After the boy left, she turned to Caleb. Probably, but he doesn't know we're onto him yet. That gives us an advantage. They didn't have to wait long. By afternoon, Morrison's carriage was rolling up the drive to the McKenna ranch, dust billowing behind it. Sarah and Caleb stood on the porch, watching him approach. Sarah's hand rested near the rifle, leaning against the doorframe, but Caleb had counseled restraint. They needed Morrison to show his hand. Morrison stepped down from the carriage with practiced grace, followed by 2 rough-looking men who were clearly hired muscle rather than legitimate associates. He approached the porch with his professional smile firmly in place. Mrs. McKenna, he said warmly, as if they were old friends. I'm so sorry for your loss. I should have returned sooner, but business kept me in Denver longer than anticipated. Mr. Morrison. Sarah's voice was ice. What brings you here? Legal matters, I'm afraid. He pulled a document from his coat pocket. I believe you're aware of my business arrangement with your late husband. I'm aware you claim to have a business arrangement. Morrison's smile flickered. It's not a claim, Mrs. McKenna. It's a legally binding contract. Thomas borrowed $5,000 from me to expand his mining operation. According to the terms, if he failed to repay the loan before his death, I would acquire a 50% interest in both the mine and this ranch. That's convenient, Caleb said quietly from beside Sarah. Him dying before he could repay. Morrison's eyes shifted to Caleb, assessing. And you are a friend of the family. I see. Morrison's tone suggested he saw more than that, but he returned his attention to Sarah. I understand this is difficult, but business is business. I've come to make you an offer. Rather than force a partition of the property, which would be expensive and unpleasant for both of us, I'm prepared to buy your half of the ranch for a fair price. You could relocate to town, start fresh, without the burden of maintaining this place alone. How generous, Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid I'll have no choice but to pursue my legal rights through the courts. The judge will review the contract and almost certainly rule in my favor, at which point we'll be co-owners of this property, which I imagine would be quite uncomfortable for you. Caleb stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet warning. That contract might not be as solid as you think. Morrison's mask slipped for just a moment, calculation showing through. The document was properly witnessed and notarized. It will stand up to any scrutiny. Will it? Sheriff Wade's voice came from behind Morrison, making the man spin around. Wade must have followed at a distance, waiting for the right moment. "Because I've been looking into your business dealings, Mr. Morrison. Interesting pattern I've found. 3 other men who borrowed money from you in the past 5 years. All of them died in accidents before repaying their debts. All of them had wives or heirs who sold their property to you at reduced prices." Morrison's face went pale, then red. "That's absurd. Coincidence, nothing more." "Maybe," Wade said, moving closer. "But I've also found witnesses at the mine who remember seeing you in the area the day Thomas died. You told everyone you were in Denver that week, but I have testimony putting you right here in Redemption Creek." "Lies. Someone's confused about dates." "Am I confused about this?" Wade pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a telegram from the Denver Marshal's office. They have no record of you being in Denver during the time in question. But I have 3 different people who saw you here, including the blacksmith who shoed your horse 2 days before Thomas's accident." Morrison's hired men shifted uncomfortably, hands moving toward their weapons. Caleb's hand moved casually to his own belt, where his knife hung. The tension ratcheted up instantly. "Careful," Wade said to the hired men. "You're already accessories to fraud. Don't add assault to the charges." Morrison's control was cracking. His smooth facade fractured, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "You can't prove anything. Even if I was in town, that doesn't mean I had anything to do with Thomas's death." "Actually," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her rage, "I think it proves quite a lot. Especially combined with the fact that Thomas wrote several letters expressing concern about your business practices. Letters we found in his office, dated just days before he died." This was a bluff. They'd found no such letters, but Morrison didn't know that. His reaction was telling. He went very still, his eyes darting between Sarah, Caleb, and Wade. "I want to see these alleged letters." "They're in Sheriff Wade's custody as evidence," Sarah lied smoothly. "Along with testimony from the mine foreman about unusual activity near Thomas's claim in the days before the collapse." Morrison's composure shattered completely. "You self-righteous fools, you have no idea what you're interfering with. That mine was worth 10 times what Thomas thought. I found the assay reports he was hiding. There's a vein of silver that could make us all rich. But your stubborn husband wanted to do things honestly, wanted to give me back my investment and cut me out." The admission hung in the air, damning and complete. Sarah's face went white with fury. "You killed him for money," she whispered. "You murdered my husband, left me alone, cost me my child, all for money." Morrison seemed to realize his mistake, but it was too late. Wade had his hand on his gun, and Caleb had moved to block any escape route. "Thomas was a fool," Morrison said, desperation making him cruel. "He had a fortune under his feet and was too simple to see it. I offered him a fair deal. He refused. What happened next was his own fault." "What happened next," Wade said coldly, "was murder. Jack Morrison, I'm arresting you for the murder of Thomas McKenna and for fraud." That's when Morrison's men made their move. The bigger one went for his gun, but Caleb was faster. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, disarming the man with brutal efficiency and putting him on the ground. The second man grabbed Sarah, using her as a shield, which was his last mistake. Sarah, who'd spent 2 years channeling her grief into rage, drove her elbow back into the man's gut with all her strength. As he doubled over, she spun and brought her knee up into his face. He went down hard, blood streaming from his broken nose. Morrison tried to run for the carriage, but Wade tackled him before he'd gone 5 steps. They went down in a tangle of limbs and dust. Morrison fought like a cornered rat, but Wade had 30 years of experience handling violent men. Within moments, Morrison was on his belly with his hands behind his back, Wade's knee in his spine. "You're done," Wade said, breathing hard. "You're going to hang for what you did to Thomas McKenna." Morrison's response was a string of curses and threats, but they meant nothing. He was caught, and he knew it. His hired men, faced with assault charges and possible accessory to murder, immediately started talking, each trying to distance himself from Morrison's actions. Sarah stood on her porch, breathing hard, her hair disheveled from the brief fight. She looked at Morrison being hauled to his feet in chains, and something in her expression was both satisfied and heartbroken. "It doesn't bring him back," she said quietly to Caleb. "Knowing who killed him, seeing Morrison arrested, it doesn't bring Thomas back." "No," Caleb agreed, "but it gives you something to build on. Truth instead of questions, justice instead of wondering." Wade loaded Morrison and his men into the carriage, turning it into a prison transport. Before he left, he approached Sarah with Thomas's pocket watch. "This belongs to you," he said gently. "I kept it as evidence, but I think you should have it now." Sarah took the watch with trembling hands. She opened it, saw the inscription inside, and tears finally came. Not the angry, bitter tears of the past 2 years, but something cleaner, grief without the poison of unanswered questions. "Thank you," she whispered. Wade tipped his hat and climbed onto the carriage. They watched as it rolled away, taking Jack Morrison toward justice. As the dust settled, Sarah and Caleb stood together on the porch. The ranch stretched out before them, no longer threatened, no longer shadowed by mystery, just land, and a house, and the possibility of a future. "What now?" Sarah asked. Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd been broken and was putting herself back together, piece by careful piece. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build, with or without ghosts, with or without fear." Sarah looked down at the watch in her hands. Then, with deliberate care, she closed it and slipped it into her pocket. Not discarding Thomas's memory, but putting it in its proper place. Part of her past, not the sum of her future. "I think," she said slowly, "I want to build something new. Something that honors what I had, but doesn't try to recreate it." "That sounds like a good start." They stood together as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, and for the first time in 2 years, Sarah McKenna could breathe without the weight of unanswered questions crushing her chest. The days following Morrison's arrest brought a strange kind of peace to the ranch. With the mystery solved and justice set in motion, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the ability to breathe without drowning. But peace, she discovered, brought its own complications. Without the consuming rage and grief to occupy her every thought, she found herself facing questions she'd been avoiding, questions about who she was now, what she wanted, and what came next. Caleb had moved from the barn into the spare room at Sarah's insistence. It felt natural, having him in the house. He rose early, made coffee, handled repairs that had been neglected for too long. They worked side by side during the days, restoring the ranch to what it had been. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked about Rebecca and Thomas, about loss and healing, about the future that stretched uncertain before them both. The town noticed, of course. Martha Collins made a point of visiting, ostensibly to bring preserves, but really to assess the situation. She found Sarah in the garden, actually planting vegetables for the first time in 2 years. "You look better," Martha said bluntly. She'd never been one for dancing around truths. "More like yourself." "I feel like a different person than I was," Sarah admitted, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm not sure who this new version is yet." "That's fair. Grief changes us. Caleb's been good for you." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "He's been a friend when I needed one." Martha's knowing look said she suspected it was more than friendship, or would be eventually. "The town's talking, you know, about you and the mountain man. Some folks think it's too soon. Others are just glad to see you healing." "And what do you think?" Martha considered, her weathered face thoughtful. "I think Thomas loved you enough that he'd want you to be happy. I think 2 years is a long time to be alone with grief. And I think Caleb Stone is a good man who looks at you like you matter, That's not something to dismiss lightly. Sarah's eyes prickled with tears. I still love Thomas. Of course you do. You always will. But loving Thomas and building a new life aren't mutually exclusive. The heart's got more capacity than we give it credit for. After Martha left, Sarah sat in her garden and thought about what the older woman had said. About capacity, about moving forward, about the difference between betraying memory and honoring it by continuing to live. That evening, she and Caleb took a walk along the fence line, checking the repairs he'd made. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The valley spread out before them, beautiful in its vastness. I need to tell you something, Sarah said, stopping at the highest point where they could see for miles. I'm grateful for everything you've done, the way you've helped me, stood by me. But I'm scared. Of what? Of feeling things I'm not ready to feel, of wanting things that feel like a betrayal. She looked at him directly. I'm scared because when I look at you, I don't just see a friend anymore. And that terrifies me, because it means I'm letting Thomas go, and I'm not sure I know how to do that. Caleb's expression was gentle, understanding. You're not letting him go, Sarah. You're making room for something else alongside the memory of him. That's different. Is it? Because it feels the same to me. When Rebecca died, I thought I'd never feel anything for anyone again. Didn't want to. The idea of caring about someone else felt like erasing her, but that's not how it works. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Rebecca taught me how to love. She made me a better man. That doesn't go away just because she's gone. And if I ever care about someone again, it'll be because she taught me how. That's not betrayal. That's honoring what she gave me. Sarah's tears spilled over. I don't know if I'm ready. Then we wait until you are. I'm not going anywhere. They stood together in the fading light, not touching, just existing in each other's presence. It was enough for now. The next week brought news from Cheyenne. Morrison's trial was set for 3 weeks hence. Sarah would need to testify, to relive the worst days of her life in front of a courtroom full of strangers. The thought made her sick with anxiety. I'll go with you, Caleb offered when Sheriff Wade delivered the summons. You don't have to face this alone. The whole town will be watching, Sarah said. People will talk. Let them talk. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. Doc Hartley visited the day before they were set to leave for Cheyenne. He found Sarah packing, her hands shaking as she folded clothes. I can give you something for the nerves, he offered. Laudanum, just a small dose. Take the edge off. Sarah shook her head. No, I need to do this clear-headed. I need to look Morrison in the eye and tell the truth about what he took from me. I can't do that fuzzy with medicine. Doc nodded approvingly. You're stronger than you think, Sarah McKenna. Always have been. You just forgot for a while. How do I do this, Doc? How do I stand up there and tell a room full of strangers about Thomas, about the baby, about all of it? You do it the same way you've survived the past 2 years, one breath at a time, one word at a time. And you remember that you're not doing it for Morrison or the court or the town. You're doing it for yourself, for closure, for justice. The night before they left, Sarah couldn't sleep. She found herself in Thomas's office, standing in the doorway, looking at the space that had been his. She'd cleaned it, organized it, but she'd kept his things, his books, his maps, the coat draped over his chair. Caleb found her there, standing in the moonlight. Second thoughts? He asked quietly. No, just saying goodbye, I think. Really saying it. Instead of just pretending, he's going to walk through the door someday. She moved into the room, touched Thomas's desk, his chair, ran her fingers over the spines of his books. We were going to have such a good life, she said. We had plans. The baby was going to sleep in the room next to ours. We were going to teach them to ride, to love this land. Thomas wanted to build a bigger barn, expand the herd. We were going to grow old here, together. I'm sorry you didn't get that, Caleb said. So am I. Sarah turned to face him. But standing here now, I realize something. Those plans died with Thomas, and I can spend the rest of my life mourning them, or I can make new plans, different ones. That doesn't mean I loved him less. It just means I'm choosing to keep living. That's a hard choice to make. Yes, but it's mine to make, and I'm making it. She walked to Thomas's desk and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote for several minutes while Caleb waited silently. When she finished, she folded the paper and placed it in a wooden box on the desk, along with Thomas's pocket watch and her wedding ring. What did you write? Caleb asked. A letter, telling him goodbye, telling him I forgive him for keeping secrets, telling him I'll always love him, but I'm ready to live again, and thanking him for the time we had. She closed the box gently, then turned away from the desk. I'm ready for tomorrow, she said. I'm ready to testify, and I'm ready for whatever comes after. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days. They traveled with Sheriff Wade, who'd arranged for lodging at a respectable boarding house. The city was overwhelming after so much time at the isolated ranch. Noise, crowds, the constant movement of people and wagons. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, but Caleb stayed close, his presence a steadying force. They walked the streets in the evening, letting her acclimate. He showed her small kindnesses, buying her dinner at a restaurant, pointing out interesting sights, keeping the conversation light when she needed distraction and quiet when she needed to think. The night before the trial, they sat in the boarding house parlor. Other guests had retired, leaving them alone with the crackling fire and the distant sounds of the city. Are you frightened? Caleb asked. Terrified, Sarah admitted. What if I freeze up there? What if I can't get the words out? Then you take a breath and try again. The judge will understand. You're not on trial, Sarah. Morrison is. All you have to do is tell the truth. The truth is so much harder than I thought it would be. Having to say out loud that I was pregnant, that I lost the baby. Having to admit that Thomas kept secrets from me. Having to face the fact that our life together wasn't as perfect as I remember it. Nothing's perfect, Caleb said gently, but that doesn't make it less valuable. You and Thomas loved each other. You built something real. The fact that he made a mistake with Morrison doesn't erase the good years. Sarah looked at Caleb in the firelight, this man who'd appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed him most, who'd seen her at her worst and hadn't turned away, who'd helped her rebuild not just her ranch but herself. After tomorrow, she said quietly, after the trial, what happens then? Whatever you want to happen. And if I wanted, she paused, gathering courage, if I wanted to see where this goes, between us, would you want that too? Caleb's expression softened. Sarah, I've wanted that since the first night I fixed your fence, but I needed you to want it too, needed you to be ready. I think I'm getting there. Not all the way yet, but closer. That's enough, Caleb said. We can take it slow. We've got time. They sat together by the fire until it burned low, talking about possibilities and futures and the shape of hope. And when Sarah finally went to bed, she slept better than she had in months, knowing that tomorrow she would face the past so she could finally, truly, begin building toward the future. In the morning, she dressed carefully, choosing her best dress. Not morning black, but a deep blue that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. A small rebellion, a small reclaiming of herself. She braided her hair carefully, pinned it up, looked at herself in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not the grief-stricken widow everyone had written off, not the angry, broken woman she'd been. Someone new. Someone who'd survived terrible things and was still standing. I can do this, she whispered to her reflection. I can face him, I can tell the truth, and then I can move forward. Caleb was waiting downstairs, dressed in his best clothes, his hair trimmed, his beard neat. He looked at her and smiled. You look strong, he said. You look ready. I am, Sarah replied. and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. Order was eventually restored, though it took several minutes, and the threat of clearing the courtroom, Morrison was hauled back to his seat, still muttering curses and threats. His outburst had sealed his fate more effectively than any testimony could have. The jury had seen him lose control, had heard him essentially confess to murder in front of a room full of witnesses. Sarah was allowed to step down. She made her way back to her seat on legs that threatened to give out. Caleb stood as she approached, and for a moment she thought she might collapse into his arms, right there in front of everyone. But she held herself together, sat down, and let him take her hand beneath the edge of the bench, where no one could see. The trial continued for another hour. Morrison's lawyer tried to salvage something, arguing that his client's outburst was misunderstood, that stress and false accusations had driven him to speak rashly. But the damage was done. The jury's faces told the story they'd already made up their minds. The judge called for closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke passionately about justice for Thomas McKenna, about a man who'd worked hard and played fair and been murdered for it, about a widow who'd suffered alone for 2 years while her husband's killer walked free, about the need to hold men like Morrison accountable, to show that wealth and clever lawyers couldn't buy freedom from consequence. Morrison's lawyer made a half-hearted attempt to suggest reasonable doubt, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Morrison had destroyed any chance of acquittal with his courtroom outburst. The jury was sent to deliberate. Sarah, Caleb, and Sheriff Wade waited outside in the afternoon sun. Other spectators milled about, smoking and talking in low voices. Everyone expected a quick verdict. They weren't disappointed. Less than an hour later, the bailiff called them back inside. The jury had reached a decision. Sarah's heart pounded as they filed back into the courtroom. Morrison sat slumped at his table, the fight finally gone out of him. He looked old suddenly, diminished, a small man who'd tried to make himself bigger through cruelty and greed. The judge asked the foreman for the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom. Sarah felt something break loose in her chest. Not joy, exactly, but relief, vindication. Thomas's death had been acknowledged as the crime it was. His life had mattered. His death would be answered for. The judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. In Wyoming Territory in 1874, the sentence for murder was death by hanging. Everyone in that courtroom knew what Morrison's fate would be. As the deputies led Morrison away, he looked back at Sarah one last time. Whatever he saw in her face made him look away quickly, his shoulders hunching as if against a blow. Outside the courthouse, people congratulated Sarah, shook Caleb's hand, praised Sheriff Wade for his persistence. Martha Collins had made the journey from Redemption Creek and pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. "You did it, girl. You stood up there and you faced him and you didn't break. I'm so proud of you." Sarah found she was crying, but they were clean tears, not the bitter ones she'd cried for so long. "It doesn't bring him back." "No," Martha agreed, "but it gives him justice, and it gives you closure. That's not nothing." Doc Hartley appeared, looking pleased. That outburst of Morrison's was a gift. His own lawyer couldn't have convicted him more effectively. "I wasn't trying to provoke him," Sarah said. I needed him to hear me. I needed him to know that he didn't break me." "He heard you," Caleb said quietly. "The whole courtroom heard you." They stayed in Cheyenne one more night. The boarding house felt different now, lighter somehow. Sarah slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in longer than she could remember. In the morning, they prepared to return to Redemption Creek. Sheriff Wade would stay to handle the remaining paperwork, but Sarah and Caleb were free to go home. Home. The word felt different now. Not just a place where Thomas had lived and died, but a place where Sarah was building a new life. As they rode out of Cheyenne, Sarah looked back at the city once. The courthouse stood solid and imposing, a monument to justice. Tomorrow or next week or next month, Jack Morrison would hang for what he'd done. The thought gave her no pleasure, but it gave her peace. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked, as they left the city behind. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Lighter," she said finally. "Like I've been carrying a weight so long, I forgot it was there, and now it's gone. I'm not happy exactly, but I'm not drowning anymore either." "That's a start." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "That's a start." They rode through the afternoon, the landscape opening up around them. The valley spread wide and golden in the autumn light. The mountains rose in the distance, solid and eternal. Somewhere ahead was Redemption Creek, and beyond it, the ranch where Sarah's new life was waiting. She thought about Thomas, about the wooden box on his desk with her letter inside, about the toy horse she'd finally moved from hiding to the mantel, where it could be seen and remembered without breaking her heart, about the garden she'd planted and the fence Caleb had repaired, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding a life from ruins. She thought about Caleb riding beside her, patient and steady, asking nothing but offering everything, about the way he looked at her like she was worth the wait, about the possibility of love that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. "Caleb," she said as they crested a hill and could see Redemption Creek in the distance. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing past my anger. For staying. For helping me remember how to be alive." He smiled, that quiet smile that had become so familiar. "You did the hard work, Sarah. I just stood beside you while you did it. That's more than anyone else was willing to do. Then everyone else was a fool." They rode on toward home, toward whatever future they would build together, two people who'd learned that surviving loss meant more than just enduring. It meant choosing, every day, to keep living, to keep hoping, to keep believing that even after the worst darkness, dawn would eventually come. 6 months later, spring arrived in Redemption Creek with a riot of wildflowers and the sound of running water as the snowmelt filled the streams. The McKenna Ranch had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The fence line stood straight and strong, newly painted white. The barn wore fresh red paint, its doors hung square and true. The garden that Sarah and Caleb had planted together was showing the first green shoots of vegetables and herbs. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, windows open to let in light and air, curtains she'd sewn herself hanging in cheerful colors. But the biggest changes were the ones you couldn't see from the road. Sarah stood on the porch in the early morning light, coffee cup in hand, watching Caleb work with the horses in the corral. He'd brought down 2 of his own from the high country, and they'd bought 3 more from a rancher selling out. The beginnings of a real operation, something they could build on together. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, the angry, broken widow who'd attacked a ranch hand in a saloon and screamed at the world that had taken everything from her. That woman felt like a stranger now, not forgotten, but transformed. The grief hadn't disappeared, she didn't think it ever would, but it had changed shape, become something she could carry without being crushed by it. Thomas's office was different now, too. She'd kept his books, his maps, the things that had been meaningful to him. But she'd cleared space for her own things, a small desk where she wrote letters and kept household accounts, a comfortable chair by the window where she could read. The wooden box with her letter to Thomas sat on a shelf, alongside his pocket watch and her old wedding ring, honored but not enshrined, part of her history, not the whole of it. The toy horse had found a place on the mantel above the fireplace. Sometimes she looked at it and felt the old ache, the what might have been that could still bring tears. But increasingly she could look at it with tenderness instead of agony, a memory of hope rather than a monument to loss. Caleb finished with the horses and walked toward the house, catching sight of her on the porch. His smile was easy, comfortable. The way he looked at her still made her heart catch, but now she let herself feel it without guilt. "Coffee still hot?" he asked as he climbed the steps. "Should be. I just made it." He poured himself a cup and joined her, leaning against the porch rail. They stood in companionable silence, watching the valley wake up. A year ago, Sarah couldn't have imagined finding peace in such a simple moment. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Martha stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Sarah said. "She wanted to remind us about the church social next week." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Is she still trying to get us married?" Sarah laughed. "Not in so many words, but she did mention that Reverend Peters is available any time we might need his services." "And what did you tell her?" "That we're doing just fine as we are." It was true. They'd settled into a life that worked for them, undefined by anyone else's expectations. Caleb lived in the spare room. They worked the ranch together, made decisions together, built something together. Whether they formalized it with marriage was a question they'd answer when they were ready, not before. The town had adjusted to their arrangement more easily than Sarah had expected. A few people had whispered, but most had simply been glad to see Sarah healing and the ranch thriving again. Doc Hartley had pronounced it the most sensible thing he'd seen in years. Sheriff Wade, who'd returned from Cheyenne with news of Morrison's execution, had simply nodded approvingly and wished them well. "I was thinking," Caleb said, "we should plant an apple orchard where that scrubland is on the east side. Take a few years to mature, but it'd be good for the future." The future. They talked about it now, made plans, imagined possibilities. Sarah had thought she'd never be able to do that again. But here she was, planning apple orchards and discussing next year's crops and thinking about the shape of the years ahead. "I'd like that," she said. "Thomas always wanted an orchard." Caleb nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. That she could honor Thomas's dreams while building new ones. That remembering the past didn't mean being trapped by it. A rider appeared on the road from town, and as he got closer, they recognized young Peter Collins, Martha's son. He rode up to the porch, breathless and excited. "Letter for you, Mrs. McKenna. Came all the way from Cheyenne." Sarah took the envelope with curiosity. It was official-looking, bearing the seal of the territorial court. She opened it carefully while Caleb thanked Peter and sent him on his way. The letter was from the court administrator. Morrison's assets, seized after his conviction, had been liquidated. After all debts and legal fees were paid, there was a substantial sum remaining. As Thomas McKenna's widow and Morrison's primary victim, Sarah was entitled to the full amount. She read the figure twice, making sure she understood it correctly. It was enough to expand the ranch significantly, to hire help, to make real improvements, more than enough to secure their future. "What is it?" Caleb asked, seeing her expression. She handed him the letter. He read it carefully, then whistled low. "That's a considerable amount of money. Blood money," Sarah said quietly. "Built on murder and fraud." "Maybe," Caleb agreed, "but you could turn it into something good. Use it to build something honest, make it mean something other than Morrison's crimes." Sarah looked out at the ranch, at the life they were building. "We could expand. Really make this place what Thomas dreamed it could be." "We could," Caleb said carefully. "Is that what you want?" Sarah thought about it, about dreams old and new, about honoring the past while choosing the future. "Yes," she decided. "But not just Thomas's dream. Our dream. Yours and mine. Something we build together." Caleb's smile was warm with approval. "That sounds right." They spent the rest of the morning making plans, sketching ideas, imagining possibilities. The orchard on the east side. A new barn to replace the one that was barely standing. Maybe hiring a hand or two to help with the heavy work. The mine could be reopened cautiously, worked properly this time, without Morrison's greed driving every decision. By afternoon, Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. She felt more alive than she had in years, engaged with the present instead of trapped in the past. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sarah thought about the night Caleb had first ridden out to the ranch, how she'd stood on this same porch with a rifle and a heart full of rage, how far she'd come since then. how far they'd both come. "Caleb," she said quietly, "I want you to know something." He turned to her, attentive. "I'm happy," she said simply. "For the first time since Thomas died, I can honestly say I'm happy. Not because I've forgotten him or stopped loving him, but because I've learned how to live with his loss instead of drowning in it. And that's because of you. Because you saw me at my worst and didn't turn away." Caleb took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You did the work, Sarah. I just held the light while you found your way through the dark." She smiled, tears threatening but not falling. "Then let's keep going forward together. Whatever comes next, let's face it the way we've faced everything else, side by side. I wouldn't have it any other way." They sat together as the stars began to appear. Two people who'd been broken and had learned to heal, who'd been lost and had found their way to something like wholeness. The ranch stretched out before them in the gathering darkness, solid and real and full of promise. Sarah McKenna had been called untouchable, unreachable, beyond saving. But she'd proved them all wrong. Not because someone had climbed the walls around her heart, but because someone had been patient enough to wait at the gate until she was ready to open it herself. And in opening that gate, she'd found not just healing but hope. Not just survival, but life. Sometimes grief doesn't just break your heart. Sometimes it builds walls so high that nobody can climb them. But sometimes, if you're lucky, someone comes along who doesn't try to scale those walls or tear them down. Someone who simply stands outside and says, "I understand, I'll wait, and whenever you're ready, I'll be here." That's not weakness. That's not giving up. That's the bravest kind of love there is. And in a valley in Wyoming territory, on a spring evening in 1875, two people who'd learned that lesson the hard way sat together on a porch and looked toward a future neither of them had thought possible. Together, healing, whole,